March 14th, 1943, 3:47 a.m., St. Catherine's Maternity Hospital, Baltimore, Maryland. Nurse-midwife Evelyn Hartwell stood in the third-floor corridor and stared at the closed door of the chief physician's office. Muffled voices drifted through, one male, calm, almost rhythmic, and one female, sobbing. Evelyn pressed closer. The woman kept repeating, "I heard him. I know I heard him cry." The male voice responded soothingly, hypnotically. "You're exhausted, Mrs. Brennan. The delivery was difficult. Your mind is playing tricks. You need rest." The door opened. Dr. Cornelius J. Whitmore emerged first, a tall, silver-haired man of 54 in an impeccable white coat. Behind him stumbled a girl of perhaps 21 in a hospital gown, face chalk white. Her eyes were vacant. She wasn't even crying anymore, just staring into nothing. Whitmore gently steadied her elbow. Quote 2. The girl nodded mechanically. Evelyn watched her disappear down the corridor and felt something cold tighten in her chest. This was the third case in a month. A mother from the countryside. Difficult labor. __quote _3__. Dr. Whitmore's strange composure. And that look, empty, burned out, as if something had been ripped from inside. Evelyn Hartwell had worked at St. Catherine's for 6 years. At 21, she completed her nursing certification at Johns Hopkins, then returned to Baltimore, where she'd been born and raised in a row house on East Lombard Street. Her father had been a dock worker at the harbor, her mother a seamstress. They'd saved for years to send Evelyn to nursing school, believing education was the path to a better life. Evelyn had been a diligent student, graduating at the top of her class. She'd wanted to help people, believed in her calling. She handled deliveries with care and tenderness. Mothers loved her, quiet, steady, patient. Never yelled, never rushed them. She'd started at St. Catherine's in the fall of 1937. At first, everything seemed normal. Standard American hospital medicine, shortages of supplies, exhaustion, night shifts, joy when a baby cried, quiet grief when one didn't. But over the past 6 months, something had changed. Evelyn couldn't explain exactly what, but she felt it. Something wrong was happening at St. Catherine's. Cases of infant loss had increased. Previously, there was maybe 1 such case per month, 2 at most. Normal statistics for a regional hospital. But since the fall of 1942, there had been 4 or 5 per month. All involved women from rural areas, farms in Carroll County, Frederick County, Harford County. All were personally documented by Chief Physician Whitmore. All produced the same reaction in mothers. Confusion, disbelief, the sense they'd been deceived. Evelyn initially thought she was imagining it. Then she started noticing details. Death certificates were always filled out in the same handwriting. Mothers were always shown the deceased infant at the same time, late at night or early morning when the ward was nearly empty. The body was removed quickly. The mother never got a proper look. Within hours, the woman would be discharged, fast, with minimal conversation. Evelyn stayed silent, afraid she'd seem paranoid, afraid if she asked colleagues they'd think her insane. But inside, the dread grew, heavy and sticky. That night, March 14th, she couldn't take it anymore. After the girl was led away, Evelyn approached the nurse's station. The door was ajar. Inside, Nurse Beatrice Fletcher sorted paperwork. An older woman, 25 years at St. Catherine's, she'd seen everything. Her face bore the lines of someone who'd witnessed too much suffering, carried too many secrets. Evelyn knocked. "Mrs. Fletcher, may I?" The nurse turned. Her face was tired, lines deep. "Come in, Evelyn." Evelyn closed the door, perched on the edge of a chair. "Tell me, that girl, Mrs. Brennan, did her baby really not survive?" Beatrice froze. A long pause. Then quietly, "Don't ask questions like that." Evelyn felt everything inside her tighten. "But, don't ask, Evelyn, do you hear me? Do your job, deliver babies, stay in your lane." There was no threat in her voice, only exhaustion and fear. Beatrice turned back to her papers. Conversation over. Evelyn stepped into the corridor. Her hands were shaking. She understood. Beatrice knew. Knew and was afraid. So it wasn't fantasy. Something really was happening here. The only question was, what? The next day, Evelyn arrived for her shift at 8 in the morning. Mrs. Brennan had already been discharged. Quickly, quietly, without witnesses. Evelyn checked the registry. Stillbirth. Cause: asphyxia during delivery. Signature: C.J. Whitmore, M.D. Evelyn flipped back through the registry. January, February, March. 8 cases of infant loss in 3 months, all involving women from farms in rural Maryland, all signed by Whitmore, all processed overnight. Evelyn closed the registry. Her decision crystallized instantly. She would investigate. Quietly, carefully, but she would. The first step was a camera. Evelyn had a Kodak Vigilant 620, a gift from her father for her 20th birthday. He'd bought it secondhand from a pawnshop on Baltimore Street, saved for 3 months to afford it. "So you can remember the good things," he'd said when he gave it to her. Compact, simple, it fit in the pocket of her uniform. Evelyn started carrying it to shifts. When opportunity arose, she photographed documents, stillbirth certificates, registry pages, signatures. She worked quickly, invisibly, shot at night when corridors were empty, or early morning before the main staff arrived. She developed the film herself. Her friend Helen worked at the Baltimore Sun and had access to the darkroom after hours. Helen asked no questions, just let Evelyn use the equipment. The prints came out sharp. Whitmore's handwriting was distinctive, large, sweeping, with a characteristic loop in the capital W. Evelyn spread the photographs on the table in her small apartment on Charles Street and studied them. 8 certificates in 3 months, all filled out by the same hand, all with identical wording: asphyxia during delivery, resuscitation efforts unsuccessful, death pronounced. But Evelyn remembered those deliveries. Not all of them, but some. Remembered receiving the infant, remembered the cry. Healthy, loud, newborn cry. And an hour later, she'd be told, __quote _15___. Evelyn started keeping a journal. Each case she recorded: date, time, mother's name, mother's hometown, her own observations. Did she hear the baby cry? What was the baby's condition when born? When did Dr. Whitmore take the infant? What did he say? How long before the mother was told the baby had died? The pattern became undeniable. Every baby she'd personally observed had shown signs of life. Every one was declared dead within hours. Every mother was sedated heavily before being told. In the spring of 1943, Evelyn decided on the next step. She needed to talk to the mothers, find out what they'd been told, what they'd seen, what they'd signed. The mothers' addresses were in the registries, farms in rural Maryland, close to Baltimore. Evelyn requested a day off, took the Greyhound bus, and traveled to a town called Havenwood, 30 miles from Baltimore. That's where one of the women lived, Grace Eleanor Brennan, 23 years old. Infant loss documented in February. She found the house easily, a white clapboard farmhouse with a sagging porch, chickens pecking in the yard. She knocked. A young woman with empty eyes opened the door. Her face was gaunt, as if she hadn't been eating properly. Evelyn introduced herself. __quote _16 _ Grace silently let her inside. They sat at the kitchen table. The house was clean but sparse. Depression-era poverty still lingered in rural areas. A photograph of a young man in army uniform sat on the mantel. Grace's husband, Thomas, serving in North Africa. Evelyn gently began asking questions. Grace spoke slowly, hesitantly. The labor had been hard, long, 36 hours. The baby was born at night. Grace heard a cry, brief but clear. She remembered thinking, "He's alive. My boy is alive." Then they gave her an injection. She fell into sleep. She woke in the morning. A doctor, tall, silver-haired, with kind eyes, said, "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Brennan. Your baby didn't survive. Asphyxia. We tried to save him, but we couldn't." He showed her a motionless body. Grace barely remembered. Her mind was foggy from the injection. Small, bluish, lifeless, wrapped in a blanket so she could barely see. She didn't get a good look. The doctor quickly took it away. Had her sign papers. Grace signed. Didn't read them. Didn't understand what she was signing. She was in shock. They discharged her that same day. Her mother-in-law came to pick her up. At home, she spent days unable to believe it. She felt sure she'd heard a cry, that the baby had been alive, but the doctor said he hadn't survived. So he hadn't survived. Doctors don't lie. Evelyn listened and felt everything inside her turn to ice. Grace shook her head. Evelyn nodded, thanked her, left. On the bus back, she stared out the window at the Maryland countryside rolling past. The picture was taking shape. Whitmore was giving mothers strong sedatives, probably morphine or a barbiturate, showing them a motionless infant body, quickly in dim light, wrapped so they couldn't see clearly, having them sign documents without explaining. The women were in shock, under the influence of drugs, didn't understand what was happening, signed whatever was put in front of them. Then they were discharged immediately, sent home before the medication wore off, before they could ask questions. But the central question remained. Where were the living babies going? Evelyn continued gathering information. Over the next weeks, she photographed more documents, recorded more addresses, traveled to more farms on her days off, spoke with more mothers. Each story was the same. Heard a cry, received an injection, woke up groggy, told the baby died. Shown something small and lifeless, always from a distance, always wrapped, always quickly removed. Signed papers without reading, discharged within hours. The picture grew clearer. Over 10 months in 1943, 14 cases of infant loss, all processed by Whitmore, all involving women from rural areas, all at night. All mothers told the same story. But Evelyn needed more than testimonies. She needed proof that the babies had been alive, that they'd been taken somewhere. She started watching Whitmore more carefully, noted his schedule. He came to the hospital every day at 7 in the morning, left around 6 in the evening. But on certain nights when there were stillbirths, he returned around midnight. His car would pull into the service alley behind the hospital. He'd enter through the back door, stay until 3 or 4 in the morning, then leave. Where did he go after leaving? Evelyn decided to follow him. On the night of June 18, 1943, another difficult delivery. A woman from a farm near Frederick, Maryland. Her name was Ruth Caldwell, 19 years old, first baby. The labor was long and painful. The baby was born at 1:20 a.m. Evelyn heard the cry, clear, strong, unmistakable. A healthy baby girl. She carried the infant to the examination room. Dr. Whitmore was there, as he always was for deliveries from rural mothers. He took the baby, examined it, listened to the heartbeat, checked reflexes. Everything normal. He said, Evelyn obeyed, but she stayed alert. She watched. An hour later, Whitmore emerged from his office with a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. He walked quickly down the corridor to the service exit. Evelyn followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. She saw him get into his black Packard sedan parked in the alley behind the hospital. She ran to the street, caught a taxi that had been dropping off a patient. __quote _25 __. The Packard drove through Baltimore's darkened streets. Wartime blackout curtains covered windows. Street lights were dimmed to prevent enemy bombers from targeting the city. Though Baltimore was far from any real threat, the regulations were strict. The car headed north, out of the city, into an upscale neighborhood called Guilford. Old oak trees lined the streets. Mansions sat back from the road behind manicured lawns. Whitmore's car stopped in front of a large brick house with white columns, a Georgian-style manor that must have cost a fortune. A woman opened the door before Whitmore even knocked. She'd been waiting. Middle-aged, elegantly dressed even at this late hour, wearing pearls. Whitmore handed her the bundle. The woman smiled, took it gently, cradled it, said something Evelyn couldn't hear. Whitmore nodded, tipped his hat, turned away. The woman disappeared inside with the baby. Whitmore returned to his car and drove away. Evelyn wrote down the address in her notebook, 4012 Greenway, Guilford. The next day, Evelyn went to the public library on Cathedral Street. She searched property records in the city directory. 4012 Greenway was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Harrison T. Ashford. Harrison Ashford was a senior executive at Bethlehem Steel, one of the largest defense contractors in the country, producing warships and armor for the military. His wife, Lillian, was prominent in Baltimore society, on the boards of the Symphony, the Art Museum, the Garden Club. No children listed in any records. Evelyn felt the pieces clicking together. Whitmore was delivering babies to wealthy couples who couldn't have children. The mothers from rural farms were told the babies had died. The babies were given to people like the Ashfords. But was it adoption or something darker? Evelyn needed to find out how the system worked. She started researching adoption laws. She went to the Enoch Pratt Free Library and read Maryland statutes. In Maryland in the 1940s, legal adoption required consent from the biological mother, required court approval, required documentation filed with the state, required home studies, required waiting periods. But if the mother believed the baby was dead, she'd sign anything put in front of her. She wouldn't be consenting to adoption. She'd be signing a death certificate, a burial permit, a release of liability. And those signatures could be used for something else, forged into adoption papers. Evelyn realized Whitmore was creating fake death certificates and fake adoption consents. He was stealing babies from poor rural mothers and selling them to rich urban families. But she needed proof. She needed to see the adoption papers. She needed to connect Whitmore to the families receiving the babies. She needed documentation that would stand up in court, and she needed to do it without getting caught. In July 1943, Evelyn took a bold step. She went to the county clerk's office in the Clarence M. Mitchell Jr. Courthouse in downtown Baltimore, asked to see adoption records. The clerk, a middle-aged man with spectacles and a bureaucrat's suspicion of unusual requests, said, __quote_26__. Evelyn explained she was conducting research on maternal health outcomes for St. Catherine's Hospital. The clerk asked for documentation. Evelyn said she'd return with it. She left, troubled. She couldn't forge a letter. That would be a crime. But she knew someone who might help. Dr. Milton Stearns, an older physician at Johns Hopkins who had mentored her during her training. He was a man of integrity, nearing retirement, with no fear of professional consequences. Evelyn went to see him, explained what she suspected, showed him her photographs, her journal, her notes. Dr. Stearns listened, his face growing graver with each detail. When she finished, he said, "This is monstrous. If what you're saying is true, this man needs to be stopped." He wrote a letter on Johns Hopkins letterhead requesting access to adoption records for a medical study on infant mortality patterns and maternal outcomes. Evelyn returned to the clerk's office the next day. The clerk examined the letter, nodded, and led Evelyn to a back room filled with filing cabinets. Evelyn searched for hours. The records were organized by year, then alphabetically by adoptive parents' surnames. Finally, she found it. Adoption records for February 1943. A baby boy, Adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Harrison T. Ashford. Birth mother listed as unknown, consent obtained. Date of adoption finalized, February 18, 1943. But Evelyn knew the real mother. She cross-referenced her notes. Grace Brennan had given birth on February 15, 1943. Her baby was declared stillborn on February 16th. The Ashford adoption was finalized 2 days later. The same baby. Had to be. Evelyn photographed the documents with her Kodak. Then searched further. Found more. 8 adoptions in 6 months, all to wealthy Baltimore families. All finalized within days of stillbirths at St. Catherine's. All with __quote _29 _ from unknown mothers. Names she recognized. The Ashfords, the Covingtons, the Sterlings, the Bradfords. All prominent Baltimore families. All members of the same social circles. All connected to hospital benefactors. It was a complete scheme. But Evelyn faced a problem. She had evidence, but who would believe her? Whitmore was a respected physician, chief of obstetrics at a major hospital, member of the American Medical Association, published researcher. The families receiving babies were powerful, businessmen, lawyers, politicians. The mothers were poor, rural, uneducated, with no social standing. If Evelyn went to the police, Whitmore would deny everything. The families would claim legitimate adoptions. The mothers wouldn't even know their babies were alive. She'd be labeled a troublemaker, probably fired, possibly sued for defamation. Evelyn needed something more. She needed a witness. Someone inside the hospital who would confirm what Whitmore was doing. Someone with credibility. She thought of Beatrice Fletcher. The older nurse had worked at St. Catherine's for decades. She'd told Evelyn not to ask questions, but that meant she knew something. Evelyn decided to approach her again, but carefully. One evening in August, after their shift, Evelyn waited for Beatrice outside the hospital. Beatrice looked around nervously. They walked to a small diner 2 blocks away on Utah Street, sat in a back booth away from other customers, ordered coffee. Evelyn said, __quote _32 __. Beatrice's hands trembled. She stirred her coffee without drinking. Long silence. Then, I saw. I've seen for 12 years. Evelyn's breath caught. Quote 34. Beatrice nodded. Quote 35. Evelyn felt physically sick. Quote 36. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. I tried. Once. In 1933. I went to the hospital administrator, Mr. Gerald Hutchins, told him what I'd witnessed. He looked at me like I was insane, said I was overwrought, probably suffering from female hysteria, needed rest. 2 weeks later, I was nearly fired for unsubstantiated accusations causing harm to staff morale. Whitmore is protected. The families he works with are powerful. Judges, politicians, businessmen. They donate to the hospital. They sit on the board. Mr. Ashford alone contributes $10,000 a year to the building fund. If I spoke up again, I'd be destroyed. I have a daughter to support. My husband died in 1935. I'm the only income. I kept quiet. God forgive me, I kept quiet. Evelyn reached across the table, took Beatrice's trembling hand. Quote 38. Beatrice looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. Quote 39. Evelyn said, quote 40. Over the next months, Beatrice became Evelyn's secret ally. She provided access to locked files in the records room, pointed out which nights Whitmore would be working late, code for another baby transfer, helped Evelyn photograph documents without being seen, standing guard while Evelyn worked. Together, they built a comprehensive file, registry entries showing the pattern of stillbirths, death certificates with Whitmore's signature, adoption records from the county courthouse, photographs of Whitmore making late-night deliveries, Evelyn had borrowed a better camera and taken long exposure shots that captured him carrying bundles to cars. Addresses of families. Written testimonies from mothers that Evelyn had collected. Financial records that Beatrice had found in Whitmore's office showing large cash deposits from prominent families. By November 1943, Evelyn had documentation on 23 cases from the past 2 years alone. Babies taken from mothers between 1942 and 1943, all still alive, living with adoptive families in Baltimore's wealthiest neighborhoods. But Evelyn still faced the problem of whom to tell. She couldn't go to the hospital administration. They'd proven themselves complicit, or at least willfully blind. Couldn't go to local police. Whitmore had connections there too. She'd seen him playing golf with the police commissioner. She needed someone outside the system, someone with authority and integrity, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. She thought of the FBI. With the war on, federal agents were investigating all sorts of corruption and black market activity, rationing fraud, draft dodging, espionage. Maybe they'd listen to a case of organized crime, because that's what this was. In December 1943, Evelyn took a day off and traveled to Washington, D.C. She went to the FBI field office on Pennsylvania Avenue. The building was imposing, all granite and authority. She asked to speak with someone about interstate trafficking. A receptionist made her wait for 2 hours. Finally, a young agent named Robert Kellerman met with her in a small interrogation room. He was maybe 30, clean-cut, skeptical. Evelyn laid out the case, showed him the photographs, the documents, the registry comparisons, explained the scheme in detail. Kellerman listened carefully, taking notes. When she finished, he said, "This is serious, very serious, but it's primarily a state matter. Maryland law, Maryland courts. The FBI doesn't typically intervene in local adoption fraud, even organized fraud. That's for state prosecutors." Evelyn's heart sank. She'd come all this way for nothing. Then Kellerman added, "Unless, were any of these babies transported across state lines? Even once?" Evelyn thought. She hadn't documented that specifically, but she remembered seeing Whitmore's car headed north on several occasions. "I don't know for certain, but some of the adoptive families have homes in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, summer estates. It's possible Whitmore delivered babies there." Kellerman nodded slowly. "If we can prove interstate transport of a kidnapped child, that's federal jurisdiction. Lindbergh law. Mann Act could apply too if he's transporting for immoral purposes, which selling babies would qualify as. We can build a case, but I need proof of the interstate element." Evelyn returned to Baltimore with renewed purpose. She started tracking the adoptive families more carefully, used city directories to find their secondary residences, watched for patterns. In February 1944, she observed Whitmore leave the hospital late at night with another bundle. This time, instead of following in a taxi, she'd borrowed her brother's car, a 1938 Ford. She followed at a distance. Whitmore drove north out of Baltimore, onto the highway toward Pennsylvania. Evelyn stayed several car lengths back. After an hour, Whitmore crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, continued to a large estate outside York, delivered the bundle to a family there. Evelyn photographed everything: the car, the license plate, the house, the exchange. Returned to Baltimore and sent everything to Agent Kellerman. In March 1944, another incident. Whitmore delivered a baby to a family's vacation home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Evelyn couldn't follow that far, but she documented the family, the Bradfords, and their known properties. Sent the information to Kellerman. The FBI agent called her a week later. "We're opening a formal investigation. This is good work, Miss Hartwell. We'll need you to testify eventually, but for now, keep documenting. Be careful. If Whitmore suspects anything, this whole case could collapse." The FBI began a careful, methodical investigation. They couldn't move quickly. Wartime priorities took precedence, and they needed ironclad evidence before confronting powerful families with connections to the war industry. Kellerman assigned 2 agents to work the case quietly. They interviewed mothers under the guise of routine war effort surveys, reviewed hospital records using Federal Health Authority, tracked financial transactions between Whitmore and adoptive families through bank records, large cash withdrawals from the families coinciding with large deposits into Whitmore's account. By September 1944, they had enough evidence to prosecute, but they were waiting for one more piece: catching Whitmore in the act of interstate transport. But before they could set up that operation, something happened that forced their hand. In October 1944, another mother came to street, Catherine's. Her name was Dorothy Hughes, 22 years old, from a farm near Hagerstown. Her husband was serving in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. She was alone, scared, in labor. Evelyn was the attending midwife. The delivery was difficult but successful. A healthy baby girl, born at 2:15 a.m. on October 12th. Evelyn heard the cry: strong, healthy, perfect. She cleaned the baby, wrapped her, started to hand her to Dorothy, but Dr. Whitmore appeared. __quote_47__, he took the infant away. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Not this one. Please, not this one. An hour later, Whitmore returned, told Evelyn, __quote_48__. Evelyn stood frozen. She knew the baby had been healthy, knew what Whitmore was doing. She couldn't let it happen again. Doctor, I examined that baby. She was breathing normally. Heart rate was strong. There was no indication of... Are you questioning my medical judgment, Nurse Hartwell? Whitmore's voice was ice. Evelyn went to Dorothy's room. The young woman lay exhausted but hopeful. Is she okay? Can I see her? Evelyn felt tears burning her eyes. She couldn't do it. Couldn't lie to this woman's face. Instead, she said. Dorothy stared at her, confused, terrified. Dorothy, shaking, nodded. 30 minutes later, Whitmore came to Dorothy's room with papers. Mrs. Hughes, I'm very sorry, but your daughter didn't survive. I need you to sign these documents for the death certificate. Dorothy, remembering Evelyn's words, said, quote 58, quote 59, quote 60. Whitmore's face tightened. Mrs. Hughes, you're distraught. I'll have the nurse give you something to help you rest. I'm not signing anything until I see my baby. Whitmore left, visibly angry. Evelyn immediately called Agent Kellerman from the hospital payphone. He's taken another baby. Tonight. The mother is refusing to cooperate. If you don't act now, he'll sedate her and process the paperwork by morning. The baby will be gone. Kellerman said, We're moving. Stay with the mother. Don't let her sign anything. Don't let them sedate her. We'll be there in 3 hours. It was the longest 3 hours of Evelyn's life. She stayed in Dorothy's room. Whitmore came back twice, trying to give Dorothy an injection. Dorothy refused. A nurse came with sedatives. Dorothy refused. Whitmore grew increasingly agitated. Mrs. Hughes, you're being hysterical. This is for your own good. I want my baby. Show me my baby. Finally, at 6:30 a.m., FBI agents arrived, walked into the hospital with badges and authority, found Dr. Whitmore in his office, found the baby, Dorothy's baby, in a bassinet, alive and healthy, waiting to be transferred. Arrested Whitmore on the spot. The case exploded into the newspapers. October 26, 1944. Evelyn's name and photograph appeared in the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, even the New York Times. She was hailed as a hero, but she felt only exhaustion and relief. Dorothy Hughes was reunited with her baby that same day, sobbing with joy and disbelief. The real work was just beginning, reuniting the other babies with their birth mothers. The FBI and Maryland Social Services began the painstaking process. They identified 83 babies taken over 12 years. Some were as old as 11 or 12 now. Some were toddlers. Some were infants. Contacted the birth mothers. Many had moved away, remarried, had other children. Many had spent years grieving babies they believed were dead. Explaining what had happened was traumatic, offering them the choice: reclaim their child or allow the adoption to stand if the child was in a good home and the adoptive parents were innocent of the scheme. It was a wrenching decision for everyone involved. Grace Brennan was one of the first mothers contacted. Her baby boy, now 20 months old, was living with the Ashfords in Guilford. When Grace learned the truth, when FBI agents came to her farm and told her son was alive, she collapsed, fainted right there on the porch. When she came to, she couldn't stop crying. Her husband Thomas had returned from the war in August, wounded but alive. Together, they drove to Baltimore, demanded to see their son. The Ashfords, devastated, brought the boy to a supervised meeting at a social services office. The child, Andrew, didn't know Grace, cried when she tried to hold him, clung to Lillian Ashford. Grace's heart broke all over again. The Ashfords had genuinely believed the adoption was legitimate. They'd paid Whitmore $5,000, a fortune in 1944, thinking it was for legal fees, medical expenses, and compensation to a birth mother who'd chosen adoption. They loved the boy they called Andrew Harrison Ashford. The thought of losing him was unbearable. But they also understood, slowly and painfully, that they'd been complicit in a crime, however unwittingly. The legal process took months. Court-appointed mediators worked with each family. In Grace and the Ashfords' case, an agreement was eventually reached. Andrew would remain with the Ashfords as his legal guardians, but Grace would be allowed monthly visitation. The Ashfords would tell him the truth when he was old enough to understand, probably around age 10. Grace would be listed as his biological mother on all official documents. The Ashfords would pay for Grace to travel to Baltimore for visits. It wasn't what Grace wanted. She wanted her son back. But she also saw how much Andrew loved the Ashfords, how secure he was with them. She made the hardest choice a mother can make. She put his well-being above her own desires. Other cases resolved differently. Some mothers, especially those whose babies were still very young, reclaimed them immediately, and the adoptive parents, heartbroken, surrendered the children. Some allowed the adoptions to continue, unable to upend the children's lives. A few adoptive families fought in court, hiring expensive lawyers, claiming they'd acted in good faith and the children's best interests required staying with the only parents they'd known. These battles dragged on for years, leaving everyone scarred. Dr. Cornelius J. Whitmore was tried in federal court in Baltimore in March 1945. Charged with 83 counts of kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Lindbergh Law for interstate transport of kidnapped persons. Also charged under the Mann Act for transporting persons across state lines for immoral purposes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Evelyn testified for 3 days, presenting her photographs, her meticulous documentation, her timeline. She explained how she'd first noticed the pattern, how she'd investigated, how she'd gathered proof. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her, calling her a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. But her evidence spoke for itself. Beatrice Fletcher testified about what she'd witnessed over 12 years, broke down crying on the stand, saying she'd never forgive herself for staying silent so long. Mothers testified about their stolen children, about the lies they'd been told, about the grief they'd carried. Dorothy Hughes testified about how Evelyn had saved her daughter. Agent Kellerman presented the FBI's findings, the financial records, the adoption documents, the pattern spanning 12 years and 83 children. The defense had no credible counter. Whitmore himself didn't testify. Sat stone-faced throughout the trial. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern man named Harold Morrison, sentenced Whitmore to 30 years in federal prison. At sentencing, he said, __quote _ 70 __. Whitmore served 17 years at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Was released in 1962, age 73. Died in 1968 in a Baltimore nursing home, alone and forgotten. The hospital administrator who dismissed Beatrice Fletcher's complaint in 1933, Gerald Hutchins, was forced to resign. Though not criminally charged, he was deemed complicit through willful ignorance. Several board members stepped down. St. Catherine's Hospital underwent a complete reorganization. New protocols were implemented. All infant deaths required independent verification by 2 physicians. All adoptions required court oversight with separate legal representation for birth mothers. All birth mothers received counseling before signing any documents. The reforms became a model for hospitals nationwide. Evelyn Hartwell became a reluctant celebrity. Newspapers ran follow-up stories for months. She received letters from across the country, from mothers whose babies had been stolen in similar schemes, from adoptees searching for birth families, from medical professionals thanking her for exposing corruption. She hated the attention, stopped reading the articles about herself. She just wanted to return to her work. But she also understood she had a platform now, a responsibility. She testified before the Maryland State Legislature when they considered new adoption laws, spoke at nursing conferences about professional ethics and the duty to question authority. In 1946, Maryland passed the Hartwell Act, named in her honor, requiring independent verification of all infant deaths and mandating third-party legal oversight of all adoptions. Other states studied the Maryland law and passed similar statutes. Evelyn continued working as a nurse-midwife, but she couldn't return to St. Catherine's. Too many painful memories. She transferred to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where she felt the ethical standards were stronger. She married in 1948 to Samuel Reed, a physician she'd met during the trial. He'd been a medical expert witness for the prosecution. A good man, quiet and principled, who respected her work and never tried to make her smaller. They had 2 children, a daughter, Margaret, born in 1949, and a son, Daniel, born in 1951. Evelyn never spoke much about the Whitmore case at home. She wanted her children to have normal lives, not grow up in the shadow of her notoriety. But she never forgot the mothers, or the babies. She kept in touch with many of them over the years, attended reunions organized by the Whitmore Survivors Group, went to weddings, saw babies she delivered grow up, get married, have children of their own. Watched them build lives despite the trauma of their origins. Some knew their full stories from early on. Others learned later and struggled with identity questions. All of them knew Evelyn's name. Many called her a second mother. In 1968, 24 years after the case broke, the Baltimore Sun ran a retrospective. A reporter named Michael Stern interviewed Evelyn for the anniversary feature, asked her what she remembered most vividly. Evelyn, now 52, said, "The crying. Not the babies crying when they were born. That's a joyful sound, the sound of life. But the mothers crying when they learned the truth, when they found out their grief had been unnecessary, that they'd been robbed of years with their children. Some of them never recovered from that. The grief of loss is terrible, but the grief of discovering that loss was a lie, that's something else entirely. That's what I remember most. That's why I couldn't stay silent." Grace Brennan's son Andrew grew up knowing his story. The Ashfords kept their promise. When he turned 10 in 1953, they sat him down in the living room of the Guilford house and explained everything. How he'd been born to Grace and Thomas Brennan, how Dr. Whitmore had stolen him, how Evelyn Hartwell had exposed the crime, how Grace had made the choice to let him stay with the Ashfords. Andrew didn't understand at first, was confused, then angry, then gradually accepting. He started visiting Grace monthly. She'd take the bus from Havenwood to Baltimore, and they'd meet at the Ashfords' house. Awkward at first. Grace didn't know how to talk to this boy who was hers but not hers. Andrew didn't know what to call her. Eventually, he settled on Mother Grace, while Lillian Ashford remained Mom. He loved them both in different ways. Grew up with the complexity of 2 mothers, 2 families, 2 histories. When he was 18 and preparing for college, he wrote a letter to Evelyn Hartwell. Never mailed it, but kept it in his desk drawer for years. It said, "You gave me the truth. My whole life I've known where I came from. I've known my birth mother. I've known my story. That's a gift most people take for granted, but I never could. Thank you for caring enough to fight for the truth. Beatrice Fletcher retired from St. Catherine's in 1958 after 40 years of nursing. At her retirement party, she finally spoke publicly about the Whitmore case. Told the assembled staff, many of whom were too young to remember, what she'd witnessed, what she'd known, how she'd been silenced, and how Evelyn's courage had freed her to finally act. Quote, 76, she said, voice shaking. Quote, 77. Quote. She died in 1965 at age 75. Her daughter donated her diary to the Maryland Historical Society. 3 decades of entries, including detailed descriptions of every case she'd witnessed, every baby taken, every mother deceived. It became one of the most important historical documents of the case. The 83 children taken by Whitmore grew up scattered across America. Some stayed in Baltimore. Others moved to New York, Philadelphia, Washington, California, Texas. By the 1970s, they started finding each other. A woman named Helen Covington, born in 1943, taken by Whitmore at 3 days old, reunited with her birth mother at age 2, created a newsletter in 1976 called Whitmore Survivors Network. Sent it to everyone she could find from the case files. Organized annual reunions in Baltimore. Dozens attended the first gathering. Shared stories. Some had thrived in their adoptive homes. Others had struggled with abandonment issues, identity crises, anger at the injustice. A few had been reunited with birth mothers and maintained relationships. Many hadn't. But they all agreed on one thing. They deserved to know the truth about their origins. And Evelyn Hartwell had given them that. In 1983, 40 years after she'd started her investigation, Evelyn Hartwell was honored by the American Nurses Association with a Lifetime Achievement Award. The ceremony was held at a hotel in Baltimore. Evelyn, now 67 years old, retired, living quietly with Samuel in a house in Roland Park, didn't want to attend. But Samuel insisted. At the ceremony, Evelyn gave a short speech. Her voice was steady, her words simple. The audience, hundreds of nurses, gave her a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. St. Catherine's Hospital installed a memorial plaque in 1985. It was mounted in the main corridor, brass with raised letters. The inscription read, "In memory of the courage of Evelyn Hartwell, R.N., who in 1943 to 1944 exposed a scheme of infant trafficking and restored truth and dignity to mothers and children. Her vigilance serves as a reminder to all medical professionals. Silence is complicity. Truth is our highest duty." Every nurse, doctor, visitor, and patient who walks through that corridor sees it. Some pause to read. Some walk past without noticing. But those who read, remember. Evelyn Hartwell died on November 12, 1998, at age 82, heart failure, peacefully, in her sleep. Her funeral at Brown Memorial Church was attended by hundreds. Former colleagues from Johns Hopkins. Mothers she'd helped decades earlier, now elderly themselves. Children whose lives she'd saved, now in their 50s and 60s, bringing their own children and grandchildren. Grace Brennan was there, age 78, frail but determined to pay respects. Andrew Ashford came from California, where he'd retired, now 55, a grandfather himself. Dorothy Hughes came from Oregon, bringing her daughter, the baby Evelyn had promised to bring back, now 54 years old, a school teacher. They all stood in the church and remembered, shared stories, cried, laughed, celebrated a life well lived. A few years after Evelyn's death, Dr. Margaret Chen, a historian at the University of Maryland, wrote a comprehensive book about the Whitmore case. The Babies of Baltimore, Evelyn Hartwell and the Fight Against Infant Trafficking, 1943 to 1945. Published in 2003. Based on years of research, interviews with survivors, access to FBI files that had been declassified, Evelyn's personal papers that Samuel had donated to the university, Beatrice Fletcher's diary, court transcripts, newspaper archives. The book was 400 pages, meticulously detailed, emotionally powerful. It became required reading in medical ethics courses at Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and nursing schools across the country. Made the case accessible to new generations who hadn't lived through it. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Morrison produced, quote, 83 for PBS. 60 minutes, featuring interviews with the few surviving mothers, women now in their late 80s and 90s, memories fading but emotions still raw. Interviews with the children, now in their 60s and 70s, reflecting on how the truth had shaped their lives. Archival footage, dramatic reenactments. The film was nominated for an Emmy, won a Peabody Award. After it aired, the PBS website received thousands of messages. Several women from other states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, contacted the filmmaker with similar stories. Babies they'd been told were stillborn in the 1930s and 1940s. Quick discharges. No chance to see the body. Sealed records. The pattern was disturbingly familiar across multiple states. Whitmore hadn't been unique. He'd been part of a larger, unspoken network of doctors exploiting vulnerable women during the Depression and war years. By the 2020s, most of the people directly involved in the Whitmore case had passed away. Grace Brennan died in 2015, age 95, surrounded by her children and grandchildren from a later marriage. Andrew Ashford died in 2019, age 76, from cancer. Dorothy Hughes died in 2020, age 98. The mothers, the babies, the witnesses, all fading into history. But the legacy lived on. Evelyn's granddaughter, Margaret Reed, named after Evelyn's daughter, became a nurse-midwife in 2015 after graduating from Johns Hopkins. She worked at the same hospital where her grandmother had finished her career. Often thought about Evelyn's story, felt the weight of that legacy. In 2018, she noticed something unusual in the maternity ward. A pattern of premature discharges for certain low-income mothers. Always processed by the same administrator, a man named Curtis Welch. Always women without insurance or family support. Margaret started asking questions quietly. Kept notes. Discovered that Welch was pressuring these mothers to sign away custody rights in exchange for reduced hospital bills. Telling them they couldn't afford to keep the baby, that adoption was the responsible choice, that he could arrange everything quickly. Not quite illegal, the mothers were technically consenting, but deeply unethical, coercive, exploitative. Margaret reported it to Hospital Ethics Committee. An investigation followed. Welch was fired. Margaret's colleagues called her, quote, 84, said she was seeing ghosts of her grandmother's case, but she didn't care, quote, 85, quote. She told them, quote, 86, quote. The story of Evelyn Hartwell became embedded in Baltimore's civic identity. Schools taught it in social studies classes. The Enoch Pratt Free Library kept a special collection. Evelyn's photographs, her journals, copies of the trial transcripts, Beatrice's diary. The plaque at St. Catherine's remained prominent even after the hospital relocated to a new building in 2005. They brought the plaque with them, installed it in the same prominent position. Medical ethics courses at Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and nursing schools nationwide use the case as a foundational example. One person, paying attention, refusing to look away, can change everything. The Whitmore Survivors Group continued meeting annually through the 2000s, though attendance dwindled each year as age and illness took their toll. At the 2022 gathering in Baltimore, only 12 people attended. They met at a restaurant near the hospital. Shared memories. Some remembered their birth mothers, the awkward visits, the complicated relationships, the grief on both sides. Some remembered their adoptive parents with love and gratitude despite the circumstances. All remembered Evelyn. At the end of the meal, they walked together to the hospital, stood in front of the memorial plaque. One of them, a woman named Helen Covington, now 79, said, __, quote 87 __. The archives of St. Catherine's Hospital still preserve the original documents from the case. The fake death certificates with Whitmore's distinctive handwriting, the forged adoption papers, the financial ledgers showing $5,000 payments, sometimes more, from Baltimore's wealthiest families. The photographs Evelyn took with her Kodak Vigilant, grainy black and white images of documents, of Whitmore's car, of the houses where babies were delivered. All cataloged, preserved, digitized, available to researchers. Graduate students come regularly, writing dissertations on medical ethics, on institutional corruption, on the history of adoption in America, on women's roles in exposing wrongdoing. They study the documents, interview descendants, analyze patterns, ask the same questions every generation asks. How did this happen? How did one man operate for 12 years undetected? Why didn't anyone notice sooner? How did one nurse-midwife succeed where institutions failed? The answer, historians and ethicists agree, comes down to three things: attention, persistence, and courage. Evelyn noticed what others ignored or explained away, refused to accept easy answers or trust authority blindly, risked her career, her safety, her peace of mind, found allies who shared her values, built irrefutable evidence brick by brick, saw it through to the end despite obstacles and threats. That's the real heroism. Not dramatic or cinematic, but quiet, methodical, stubborn. The heroism of doing the right thing when it would be easier to look away. In 2024, 80 years after the FBI raid that ended Whitmore's scheme, the Maryland State Archives completed a multi-year project to digitize the complete Whitmore case files, made them publicly accessible online through a searchable database. Researchers, descendants, journalists, students, anyone interested can now access thousands of pages of documents. See Evelyn's handwritten notes, her careful observations, her questions, her growing horror as the pattern emerged. Read the mother's testimonies, their pain, their confusion, their resilience. Study the legal proceedings, the indictments, the trial transcripts, the appeals, the final judgments. The transparency is itself a legacy, a commitment that this history won't be hidden, won't be forgotten, won't be sanitized into comfortable myth. One researcher in 2025, a graduate student named Thomas Brewster working on a dissertation about medical ethics in the 1940s, found something particularly moving in the digitized files. Evelyn's personal journal from March 1943, just as she was beginning her investigation. One entry, dated March 15th, the day after she'd seen Grace Brennan in the corridor, read, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if anyone will believe me. Dr. Whitmore is respected, powerful, connected. I'm just a nurse. Who listens to nurses? But I know what I heard. Those babies cried. They were alive. And their mothers deserve to know. If I stay silent, I become part of the lie. I become complicit in the theft of these children. I can't live with that. So I won't stay silent, whatever it costs me." That's the choice she made. And it cost her plenty. Sleepless nights documenting evidence, constant fear of being discovered, professional relationships destroyed, years of stress that probably shortened her life. But it gave 83 children their truth, gave their mothers justice and closure, gave the medical profession a crucial lesson about the importance of whistleblowers and the dangers of unchecked authority, gave future generations, including her own granddaughter, an example to follow when they face their own moments of moral choice. The story never truly ends. It lives as long as people remember, as long as they tell their children and teach their students, as long as they watch the documentaries and read the books and visit the archives, as long as they pause at memorial plaques and think about what they mean, as long as new generations of nurses and doctors learn about Evelyn Hartwell and ask themselves, would I have the courage to do what she did? Would I see what she saw? Would I act? Evelyn Hartwell's story is ultimately about a simple truth, that deception, however well organized and well protected, cannot stand forever against determined honesty. That one person with evidence and courage is more powerful than a corrupt system backed by wealth and influence. That heroism doesn't require dramatic gestures, Sometimes it's just a quiet nurse with a camera, a notebook, and a stubborn refusal to look away. Someone who did what needed to be done simply because it was right. And that kind of courage, that kind of integrity, echoes across generations, inspiring others to see clearly and act bravely when their own moments come. In the final analysis, examining this case from the perspective of 8 decades later, several elements stand out as particularly significant. First, the systematic nature of Whitmore's operation. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was calculated, organized, sustained over more than a decade. He'd built infrastructure. The preserved infant body used to deceive mothers, the network of wealthy clients, the falsified documentation process, the timing protocols to minimize witnesses. He'd corrupted the very institution meant to protect vulnerable women. Second, the power dynamics that enabled him. Whitmore operated with impunity because he occupied multiple positions of authority simultaneously. Respected physician, hospital chief, member of Baltimore's medical establishment, associate of the city's elite families. Challenging him meant challenging the entire social structure. Third, the isolation of his victims. Rural women, poor, often alone, without education or resources, facing a medical system that treated them as objects rather than people. They had no voice, no advocate, no platform to question what they were told. And that's what makes Evelyn's intervention so crucial. She gave them voice. She created the platform for truth, not because she was powerful, but because she paid attention and refused to rationalize away what she observed. The psychological toll on Evelyn was considerable. In letters to her friend Helen, she described nightmares, anxiety, constant fear of being discovered. Fear that Whitmore would realize she was investigating. Fear that even with evidence, powerful people would protect him. She wrote in September 1943, "Some days I think I should stop, that I'm risking everything for a fight I can't win. But then I think about those mothers. I can't stop. Even if I fail, I have to try." That doubt and fear makes her courage authentic. She wasn't fearless. She was afraid and did it anyway. The impact of the Whitmore case extended far beyond the 83 identified victims. The publicity surrounding the trial prompted adoption law reforms across the United States. By 1950, 32 states had passed legislation requiring independent verification of infant deaths in hospitals. The American Medical Association created new ethics guidelines specifically addressing physician conduct in adoptions. The case contributed to broader conversations about women's rights and medical autonomy. The Whitmore case demonstrated the dangers of medical paternalism. Those mothers had been deliberately kept ignorant, deliberately sedated, deliberately prevented from seeing their babies. The case became a rallying point for advocates of patient rights and informed consent. Evelyn became involved in these broader movements, though reluctantly. She testified before Congress in 1947 when federal patient rights legislation was being considered. Wrote articles for nursing journals about patient advocacy. Her message was consistent. Medical professionals have a duty to patients that supersedes institutional loyalty. Her personal papers reveal the depth of her commitment. She kept every letter from mothers and survivors, hundreds over the years. She answered every one with thoughtful responses and maintained those relationships until her death. As the 21st century progresses and the last survivors of the Whitmore case pass away, the question becomes, how do we keep this story alive? How do we ensure that future generations learn from it? The memorial plaque at St. Catherine's helps. The books and documentary help. The digitized archives help. But ultimately, stories survive because people choose to tell them, choose to remember them, choose to extract meaning from them. Evelyn Hartwell's story survives because it speaks to something fundamental: the lonely courage of standing up for truth when everyone else is silent. The moral clarity to see wrong and refuse to normalize it. The practical persistence to build a case that can't be ignored. Every generation faces situations requiring those qualities. Every generation needs examples of people who embodied them. Evelyn Hartwell provides that example. Her story asks each person, what would you do? Would you notice? Would you question? Would you act? Would you risk everything for truth? Most people don't know until the moment arrives. But knowing Evelyn's story, seeing what one determined person accomplished, might make the difference when that moment comes. Might give someone the courage to take that first step, make that first phone call, document that first piece of evidence. And that's how justice happens. Not through grand institutional reforms alone, though those matter, but through individual acts of courage that accumulate into unstoppable momentum for change.